On that anxious day of the 25th of July, Collins was fighting his way to the bombed-out section at St. Lo and paving the way for the army, which now consisted of 21 American divisions. It was the largest combination we had ventured to entrust to a single army command. By bringing together 1.5 times as many divisions as the regulations for a single field army, we created an excessive overload on the headquarters and logistics of the First Army. Back in early July, Eisenhower gave me the right, if necessary, to divide the American troops on the continent into 2 field armies. In doing so, I was to transfer the First Army to Hodges and take command of the 12th American Army Group. In this regard, Monty was leaving his temporary post as commander of the Allied ground forces and returned to the post of commander of the 21st British Army Group. He and I, as commanders of the 2 groups of armies, were equally subordinate to the general command of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Initially, the limited size of our bridgehead made it impractical to divide the American forces into 2 field armies, as it would lead to an increase in the number of service units, which were already too many. I had no reason to ask to be taken out of the command of Montgomery, who headed the British Army Group. Monty by no means restricted our rights or gave us cause for discontent, since he gave American troops full freedom of action. We were willing to remain under his command until the situation at the front does not require changes. On 20 July, Ike flew to us to participate in a meeting about Operation Cobra. He looked anxiously at the flags of divisions, which were all over the operational map of the headquarters of the First Army, and asked when we expect to create a group of armies. The headquarters of the 12th Army Group landed on the shore, but was ordered to remain in reserve until the formation of the 2nd American Army. In the meantime, Patton had located the command post of his 3rd Army, surreptitiously moved from England, in the northern part of the Cotentin Peninsula behind Middleton's 8th Corps. With him were the headquarters of the 3 corps awaiting the arrival of troops. Despite Patton's fervent desire to help us in the Operation Cobra, I, wishing to facilitate the management of troops, decided that in the offensive will participate only the First Army, at least until the divisions of the 1st Echelon did not finish breaking through the enemy defences. While Collins dissected the German front line and broke through to the coast, seeking to cut off enemy troops on the Isthmus of Cotentin, Middleton was to strike along the road to Coutances and connect with Collins. Middleton would then move on Avranches and turn towards the Brittany Peninsula. We anticipated that where the troops of the 7th and 8th Corps would meet, there would be a traffic jam on the roads, which could only be cleared when new delineation lines were defined for the corps. We would have to regroup troops during the operation to keep up the pace of the offensive. I assured Ike that it would be much easier for us to eliminate the jam, controlling the troops from the command post of the First Army, than to agree on it at a meeting with the commanders of the 2 armies at the command post of the Army Group. At this stage of the operation was important, every minute, and then Patton and I would easily divide the troops of the First Army and create a new link in the chain of American command. "Would you like to set a time limit for the organization of the Army Group?" Ike asked, giving me the right to decide the question. I suggested 1 August. This gave me the opportunity at least a week after the breakthrough directly lead the troops from the command post of the First Army. Fine, he said. Let it be 1 August. But even after the establishment of our American Army Group, Eisenhower did not immediately remove us from the subordination of the 21st Army Group Montgomery. As long as the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force remained in England, Eisenhower could not carry out the day-to-day management of ground troops who were in France. For this reason, Monty was appointed Eisenhower's deputy for the duration of the invasion. Now that our group of armies was equalized with Monty's group, it was assumed that Eisenhower would assume command of the ground forces and direct responsibility for the interaction of both groups. However, this direct command of troops across the Channel was fraught with risk, as it was difficult to ensure reliable communications with Eisenhower. For example, the weather could delay Eisenhower in England just at the moment when he needed to urgently arrive in France to make a decision. This problem disappeared with the transfer of the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force to the bridgehead, but we have not yet captured a major city that could accommodate this headquarters. Therefore, until the headquarters did not move to France, Eisenhower assigned to Monty the duties of his deputy and entrusted him with temporary operational control over the American group of armies. However, the rights of the Englishman was limited. He was entrusted only to coordinate actions and determine the delineation lines between our groups. Despite the transfer of some of his powers to Monty, Eisenhower still led the command of both groups of armies. Although this compromise solution did not provide our group of armies the independence that we were promised in England, I did not object to it. If, as commander of the army, I enjoyed complete freedom of action, I had no reason to believe that Monty would try to restrict me now that I became commander of the army group. The supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force did not authorize the publication of a report on the change in Allied command. On 14 August, however, an Associated Press correspondent broke the ban and reported that the U.S. 12th Army Group had been equalized with Monty's Army Group. This essentially innocuous report was only a fortnight ahead of schedule. Full equality between us was to be established after Eisenhower moved to France, yet it immediately provoked a storm of indignation in England. The British perceived the equating of the American command with the command of the 21st Army Group, Monty, as a deliberate insult to the English national hero. Unaware of the original agreement contained in the Operation Overlord plan, which provided for Anglo-American equality of command, the British press claimed that Montgomery's role had been undeservedly diminished, that his prestige as commander of ground forces had been undermined by the U.S. demand for equality. Some correspondents saw the whole affair as a demotion for Monty and an undeserved offence to the British people. The newspaper articles so disorientated public opinion that I suggested that the question of the Anglo-American chain of command be clarified immediately. The question of the equal position of the American command and the command of the 21st Army Group, Monty, had been decided in England months before the invasion, and this decision was fixed in the plan of Operation Overlord. No one was going to permanently retain Montgomery as Eisenhower's deputy for ground forces. Had such a proposal been made, I would have strongly opposed it. Knowing that the United States would have to commit 2/3 of all ground troops, I saw no reason to put us under the British command. Eisenhower was angered by the premature disclosure of our agreement, because the violent reaction of the English press threatened to disrupt the friendly relations between the troops of the Allies, which he was so zealous to establish. Had he immediately announced his plan to give equal rights to both British and American commanders, he might have been able to forestall this ridiculous disagreement. But, perhaps fearing to offend the British, he refrained from explanation. Finally, on 31 August, the 12th Army Group was withdrawn from Montgomery's command, and the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force granted equal statute to the British and American groups. This was timed to coincide with the publication of the announcement that General Montgomery had been promoted to the rank of Field Marshal. Although we paid no attention to the uproar raised by the English press, I still wondered why Monty did not silence the newspapers. He could have easily calmed the English correspondents by informally explaining to them how the question of command was decided in the plan of Operation Overlord. Perhaps I was unfair to Monty, but I couldn't help but conclude that he simply didn't want to provide clarification. The rapid advance of American troops in mid-August undermined the prestige of the British, while we were rushing towards Paris, bypassing pockets of enemy resistance. The 21st Army Group fought at Cayenne, fulfilling the task that was assigned to it under the plan of Operation Overlord. The knowledge that Montgomery was doing his duty was little consolation to the British, who were eager to play a leading role in ground operations. England lacked manpower, so the British could only hope to have their claims honoured if Montgomery was retained as commander of all Allied ground forces. As long as Monty remained in that post, even American troops could be referred to as Montgomery's troops, and any mention of them could help increase British prestige. When the Third Army monopolized the newspaper headlines for a month after the breakthrough, even our First Army began to feel the envy that had so dampened the mood of the British. The task that had been set for the First Army did not allow it to unfold as it would have liked. This unfortunate crack in our relations, which had appeared in August, was never completely eliminated. Throughout the winter fighting, there was behind-the-scenes talk of bringing Monty back as commander of the ground forces. During the battle in the Ardennes, Montgomery's supporters openly stated that von Rundstedt's breakthrough could have been prevented if Eisenhower had agreed to combine control of both army groups. However, these assumptions are refuted by the documents. For on the eve of the offensive undertaken by von Rundstedt, Montgomery unwittingly admitted that he was no more prescient than the rest of us. Although Montgomery this time and could curb his supporters, however, he studiously ignored them. In fact, during the offensive from the Seine to the German state border, he even himself hinted that if the command of ground troops was entrusted to him, he would shorten the duration of the war. Monty believed that the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force was too far from the battlefield and was unable to manage the day-to-day operations of 3 independent groups of armies. He, Monty, could remedy the situation and eliminate the difficulties experienced by the supreme headquarters. To do this, it was only necessary to create a command of land forces headed by him, which would be an intermediate link of control between Eisenhower and the headquarters of the army groups. This position of Monty contributed to some extent to the spread of the false rumor that Eisenhower had acted in Europe primarily as a political leader and was not faced with day-to-day tactical problems. There is not a grain of truth in this fabrication, for Eisenhower proved himself to be a superb tactician with an excellent knowledge and understanding of the situation on the front. With Bedell Smith assuming much of the administrative duties, Eisenhower was able to deal mainly with the direction of the fighting. His talents in tactics were already evident long before the war at Leavenworth, where he graduated with top honors in 1926. It was at Leavenworth that the most able officers of the American Army studied the tactics and organization of the rearguard services of the higher formations and formations. Pike directed the combat operations of the troops, for the most part by personal discussions with the commanders of groups of armies. Therefore, only 3 people, Montgomery, Devers and I, could appreciate his exceptional insight in the role of commander of field troops. Very often, even the officers of the Operations Division of the Supreme Headquarters were not aware of the matters discussed in our confidential meetings with Eisenhower, nor were the operations officers on my staff aware of these matters. After October, Eisenhower and I were in almost daily telephone contact, and he was fully informed of my every move. Very often we worked out our prospective plans during late-night conversations at the command post of Ike or my army group. Sometimes we sat up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, exchanging views and discussing plans for the next stages of the campaign. It would therefore be difficult for historians to ascertain the views of one commander or another, or to apportion between them the laurels for making crucial decisions. However, Eisenhower gave us more than he got from us. In saying this, it is not my intention to diminish Montgomery's virtues or to tarnish his fame in order to show that Eisenhower was superior to him as a commander. During the winter campaign, Eisenhower was surprised to learn that Montgomery claimed command of all Allied ground forces. At the same time, Monty did not want to give up command of his group of armies in order to be eligible to become Eisenhower's deputy for ground forces. Thus, Monty wanted to retain the 21st Army Group, and in addition to take on the role of commander of all Allied ground forces. Monty is not enough tit in hand, said with irritation Ike. Give him and the crane in the sky. 6 July Patton crossed the English Channel and landed in France with the first echelon of the headquarters of the Third Army. His arrival was surrounded by the strictest secrecy, for if the enemy became aware of the forthcoming task of his army, to follow in the second echelon after the breakthrough troops, our deception with the Pas de Calais would be exposed. We gave George a bivouac on the Cotentin Peninsula, where his troops were to wait until 1 August, and then, that is, a week after the breakthrough of the First Army, to enter the battle as part of the 12th Army Group. I personally regarded George with mixed feelings. I was not the one who had suggested that he be appointed army commander, and I was concerned about how he would react to the fact that we had switched roles. After all, George was 6 years my senior and had commanded an army during the Sicily campaign in which I had the opportunity to be a corps commander. I did not really want to have George under my command and feared that curbing his stroppy temper would cost me too much labour. But at the same time I knew that under Patton I would have no need to push the Third Army. I would only have to see to it that he did not deviate from the direction he had indicated. George soon made me repent of my unworthy apprehensions, for he not only showed no ill will towards me, but carried out my orders with exceptional zeal and devotion to duty. Soon after the war ended, an officer of the Third Army told me that Patton often criticized his senior superiors sharply. But, he said, I never heard a general utter a single harsh word against you. A little time passed, and the new Patton completely dispelled all my unfounded fears. He and I formed the friendliest and most contented pair in the ranks of the High Command. Patton was no longer the swaggering soldier he had been at times in Sicily. He was now a sensible, judicious, and self-effacing commander. A few months later, when George outlined the plan of a maneuver, I pointed out to him some mistakes. Instead of responding to me with irritation, as he would have done a year earlier, George just squinted his eyes and said, shuckily, "You're right, Brad, damn it. You're always right." Patton, however, could not be said to have been completely reborn. He retained his impetuosity. Even in Europe, this restless nature continued to trouble those around him. The first wrong deed was committed by him only 12 days after arriving at the bridgehead, when the Third Army impatiently trampled on the Khotin Peninsula. As soon as the plan for Operation Cobra was ready, I told Patton about it, as he was to get involved in the fighting once it unfolded. On 18 July, 2 days before we intended to outline our plan to the correspondents attached to the First Army, Dixon appeared to me, purple with indignation. "We have learnt from our correspondents, General," he said, "that Patton has told the press at the Third Army about Operation Cobra." "Nade nit," I exclaimed and rushed to the telephone, but George was not there. Patton himself called me that evening and offered his apologies and explanations. Yes, he had told his staff about the First Army's breakout plan, but the correspondents had not been allowed to attend that meeting. The plan was revealed to the correspondents by his press officer. "I'll kick him out," he promised. "You can be sure I'll kick him out as soon as we find someone else." I hung up. George was in so much pain that I shouldn't have upset him with my remarks. He eventually removed that officer, but for different reasons. 2 days later, on 20 July, we were cheered with news of an assassination attempt on Hitler. Incidentally, Churchill expressed our unanimous opinion when he is reported to have said, "They haven't killed the bastard, but the time is not yet up." We were very encouraged by the fact that the feeling of discontent pushed some layer of the German army to conspire to save the Reich by killing the Führer. For several days we waited for signs of internal collapse, but the assassination attempt was unsuccessful and the favourable opportunity was lost. Few of us foresaw the ruthlessness with which Himmler would begin to restore order in order to discourage any attempt to assassinate the Führer another time. Subsequently, I repeatedly wondered why the German commanders do not stop the senseless resistance, which could only increase the catastrophe that threatened Germany. I was given the answer by George Patton, who came to Army Group headquarters in early August, when we were tightening the noose around the German 7th Army. "Hey, the Germans have either gone mad or they don't know what's going on," I said. "The career officers must surely realize that their song has been sung." Instead of answering, George told me about a German general captured by the Third Army only a few days ago. The Chief of Staff Intelligence asked him why he had not surrendered earlier, if only to save Germany from further casualties. "I am a soldier," the German replied calmly, "and I am following orders." Most career military men would have given the same answer. After all, few soldiers are able to determine at what point military resistance becomes morally pointless and turns into political suicide. Pétain was one of those who dared to make his judgment, but his example could not encourage others. When news of the attempted assassination of Hitler reached Patton, who was at that moment on the Khotin Peninsula, he rushed to our command post at Columbia. "For heaven's sake, Brad," George pleaded, "you must send me into battle before the war is over. I'm stuck in this doghouse now, and I may die if I don't do something extraordinary to get out of it." I've often wondered to what extent this mood of a man with nothing to lose helped Patton in his rapid advance in France. For surely no other commander could have matched him in recklessness of action and courage. Some day a detailed biography of Patton will cover this question more fully. For now, I am inclined to think that the soldier he slapped in the hospital in Sicily did more to win in Europe than any other private in the army. Just 34 days after George joined the battle for France, he joined me in asking Ike to retain his allotted tonnage needed to keep the traffic in the German frontier moving. "Hey, if you don't cut our supply ration, we can make do with what we get," he said. "I'll stake my reputation on it." Careful, George," Ike quipped. "Your reputation isn't worth much." Muttiel tightened his belt and smiled. It's not bad now." And indeed, judging by the newspaper headlines, it was. As soon as Collins had regrouped his troops where his front had been torn by our bombers, and closed the gap on the stretch reaching the Perrier-Saint-Lô road, he moved swiftly forward over the smoking ground. Already his first reports of the results of our air action dispelled the despondency which had enveloped us like a damp fog. Although the aviation had caused us some damage, it had dealt a crushing blow to the enemy. The cratered fields and roads were strewn with the black hulks of burnt-out tanks, the mangled bodies of soldiers, and the bloated corpses of animals. By midday on 26 July, 24 hours after the beginning of the offensive, we realized that the first sharp moment had passed and it was time to boldly build on the success of the breakthrough. On the evening of 27 July, the 1st Division broke through to the outskirts of Coutances, while Middleton was overcoming minefields laid by the enemy in his offensive lane, considering that the 8th Corps would join Patton's Third Army as soon as the latter was brought into the battle. I gave orders to George to follow Middleton's columns in order to assist them if necessary. On 1 August, when we divided the First Army, giving half of it to Patton, the 2 armoured divisions had already bypassed Avranches and entered the Brittany Peninsula. Our rapid advance caught the enemy by surprise, and now, in a hurry to rectify the situation, he transferred armoured forces from Montgomery's front to our front. Leaving the First Army on 1 August to take charge of the 12th Army Group, I quietly left the army to Hodges, my old hunting companion while at Fort Benning, who had been my intended successor 6 months earlier. A calm and methodical commander, he knew his business perfectly well and was considered one of the most capable troop trainers in the army. Patton rarely cared about details, but Hodges with exceptional care studied all matters and was better prepared than George to lead more complex operations. Always poised, reliable man, not allowing himself any theatrical gestures, but possessed of great persistence and perseverance, Hodges became, in fact, the soul of the defeat of the 7th German Army, remaining in the shadows, while Patton struck the final blow. Hodges was perfect for his task, and Patton was perfect for his. With the departure of the First Army, an unforgettable period of the war ended for me. Most of the officers on the staff of that army had travelled with me a long way from Tunisia to France. To them I owed much of the good fortune that invariably accompanied me in all campaigns. But the Army Group headquarters, unlike the Army headquarters, was a planning and controlling body. It did not deal with the rear, so it could not use the organizational skills of the officers of the special part of the First Army headquarters. In addition, I accepted the general part of the Army Group headquarters, staffed as early as divas. Therefore, there was no need to introduce into it officers of the general part of the First Army headquarters. But since we had a lot of work to do in selecting commanders and receiving replenishments, I took with me from the 1st Army O'Hare as head of the personnel section of the Army Group headquarters. No one had such a knack of sneaking in the back door of various official offices, and no one was more successful at getting things done than the red-haired O'Hare. After agreeing to O'Hare's transfer, Courtney took out his mouthpiece, looked at me, and asked with a smile, "Anyone else?" I'd agreed with him earlier that I was taking Hanson and Bridge. More, I began. Courtney shuddered. He was afraid I might take Bill Keane. "Do you mind if I take Sergeant Dudley?" Courtney gave a sigh of relief. "Now that it's down to sergeants, can I assume my colonels are safe?" "Of course, Dudley is my last request." "Good. You found him yourself?" replied Hodges. "I think we should let him go." 35-year-old Sergeant Richard Dudley of Scarsdale, New York, was a printer in Manhattan before the army. He came to our headquarters in Bristol, where he was appointed commandant of the Holmes building. We took him from a battalion of military police. In France, he soon proved himself one of the most ingenious dodgers and gained a rather unpleasant fame. Seeing that our comfort was increasing, I asked Dudley how he managed to provide such comforts in the field. "General," he replied with his usual abruptness, "your business is to wage war, and mine is to look after your comforts." Dudley refused the rank of officer for the rest of the war, and accepted it only shortly before his discharge from the army. "I didn't want to lose my place," he later explained to O'Hare. Unlike our primitive quarters in the First Army, the 12th Army Group headquarters was housed in a camouflaged tent city in a picturesque location a few kilometers north of Coutances. At first, I was concerned about the excessive dispersion of the headquarters. Fearing to lag behind and break away from the front, I instructed the Chief of Staff of the Army Group, Major General Leven Allen, to organize a task force headquarters which could keep up with the rapidly advancing armies. This group we dubbed Eagle Tech. Eagle was the code name of the 12th Army Group, and TAC distinguished the task force from the main headquarters and the rear echelon of headquarters. Apart from the communications and service units, the Eagle TAC had only the backbone of the following headquarters divisions: intelligence, operations, rear, and engineering. For the most part, they were all housed in RVs, allowing the task force to relocate quickly if necessary. At its inception, Task Force Eagle TAC had a total of 65 officers, and about twice that number of NCOS and enlisted men. Like any staff, however, Eagle TAC began to grow like a mushroom, and despite O'Hare's best efforts to reduce its staff, the task force nearly doubled in size in 3 months. But even this bloated task force was highly agile, not unlike most higher headquarters in the European theatre, which were extremely bulky. Eagle TAC retained a simplicity that made it look like a crossroads village that was pleasant to live and work in. While Eagle TAC moved swiftly forward with the armies, the main headquarters and rear were dragging somewhere behind. Until we got the entire headquarters together in Wiesbaden at the end of the war, Eagle TAC had made 10 crossings, while the main headquarters and rear had made only 4. The name Eagle was given to the 12th Army Group to emphasize its seniority in the American chain of command. The normal order of coded communications required that I, as the general commanding this group, be listed as Eagle 6. When Montgomery learned of our designation, he gave 21 Army Group the conventional name Lion L. To Patton, we became Eagle and Lion. Other headquarters allowed themselves the same jokes with their conventional names. With a vanity forgivable to a headquarters with 2 campaigns under its belt, the First Army gave itself the name Master. And, as if to make fun of the failure that haunted the Third Army in Sicily, Patton gave it the name Lucky. When the Ninth Army arrived at the front in late August, it was given the conventional name Conqueror, and the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force decided to call itself Shellburst. While Middleton's 8th Corps under Patton was rounding Avranches on its way to the ports of Brittany, I ordered George to put up strong outposts in the centre of the base of the Brittany Peninsula. There they could repel any threat from the east, while Middleton's columns would advance towards Stest Malo, the first fortress on the north coast of Brittany. While the rest of the Allied front carried out its pivotal movement towards the scene, the First Army had to keep open the passage at Avranches, repelling the onslaught of German armoured forces hurriedly thrown into that area. Visiting Middleton's command post on 2 August, I found the 8th Corps commander concerned that his left flank and rear were open to enemy attacks. Patton had ignored Army Group's order to create a strong barrier at the base of the Brittany Peninsula, and instead ordered Middleton to move quickly toward Rennes and Brest. As a result, there was no covering force between Middleton's outstretched columns and the main force of the German 7th Army, which was in their rear. Middleton did not want to violate the order of the army commander, but at the same time he feared a German counterattack. He pointed to the map. "Hey, I wouldn't want to advance when I have such a large enemy force in my rear," he said, "especially because the rear is so exposed. If the Germans break through at Avranches to the coast, they will lock me up in Brittany." By this time, Middleton's 2 infantry and 2 armoured divisions had already passed Avranches. If the enemy broke through to the sea at Avranches, he could cut off over 80,000 men. "Damn it, Moo," I said unhappily to Middleton. "George seems to be interested in only one thing, to capture Brest and get in the headlines. He's too lazy to think of a plan of operation. I don't care if you take Brest tomorrow or in 10. If we cut off Brittany, we'll take Brest somehow. But we can't leave the flank open. That's why I've ordered George to block the base of the peninsula." The 79th Division halted north of Avranches, but at this point its units were already loading back onto vehicles to move on to Brittany. I rang Patton at the 3rd Army Command Post, but was told he was not available. Meanwhile, Middleton was racking his brains trying to find a way out of the situation. "Order the 79th Division to head for Fugères, and we'll set up the barrier George was ordered to make there," I said. "We can't waste time. If the Germans hit us on the open flank with at least 2 divisions, we will be in trouble." When I arrived at Patton's command post in the evening, he had just returned there in his jeep. He was covered in a thick layer of dust after a day in the front lines. "For God's sake, George," I began, "what do you think you're going to do about Middleton's open flank? I've just ordered the 79th Division to go there, but I wouldn't like to give orders to the corps over the head of the army commander." George smiled confusedly and put his arm around my shoulders. "Oh, fine, Brad," he said. "That's exactly what I would do. But enough about that, let me show you how we're getting on." The strategic importance of Brittany was based on the premise of the original plan of Operation Overlord, that we would have to regroup on the Seine and overcome a strong German fortification there before moving into the wreck. During this halt, it was intended to reorganize our lines of communications, taking into account the stormy weather in the Channel and the loss of tonnage in unloading on the coast. We were to hand Cherbourg over to Montgomery as a supply base for British troops, and to establish the unloading of our Atlantic convoys at the more convenient ports of Brittany. Anticipating that the enemy would destroy Brest before evacuating it, we planned to turn Quiberon Bay into a supply base for the American armies. Quiberon Bay stretches from the port of Lorient to the port of Saint-Nazaire. To utilize it, we had to build wharves. At the same time, we would have cleared the port of Sti-Malo to the north for the importation of coal needed by the French. Despite the fact that the enemy moved some troops from Brittany to counter the landing in Normandy, the coastal strip of this peninsula was defended by German garrison troops numbering 50,000 people. To prevent the Germans from destroying the railways and bridges, Patton had to quickly push them back into fortified areas around the major ports. We would then have to smoke them out of there. In the sparsely populated rural areas of Brittany, the French partisans were our valuable allies. Aircraft at night supplied them with weapons and even small jeeps, albeit in limited numbers. With the help of our specially trained sabotage teams dropped by parachute, the French partisans blocked the roads of Brittany and forced the Germans to take refuge in forts. At that time, the enemy had not yet learnt to combine their forces. When the commander of German forces in Brittany tried to unite all forces, the garrisons of air and naval bases refused to obey him. Hitler himself contributed to this dispersion in the troops. He ordered all commanders, without regard to how appropriate, at all costs to hold their positions, and most importantly, do not cede to the Allies not an inch of territory. As a result, the enemy was unable to organize an effective counter to our advance, and was forced to take refuge in their fortified coastal cities. One of our infantry division approached the port of Saint-Malo, located on the rocky coast, and tank column forced marching towards Nantes. The other column rushed westwards to the fortress of Brest, which was at the very tip of the Brittany Peninsula. On 6 August, Patton called me to the group command post and reported the capture of Brest. I found this news hard to believe, for the enemy did not usually give up such valuable booty without a fight. Patton, however, stood his ground, for he was convinced of the truth of the report. It came, he said, directly from Brest from the commander of the tank column. Still not believing this, I notified the air commander of Patton's message. The British Air Force was planning to bombard the concrete submarine shelters in the port of Brest in order to block the exit of those submarines that might still be there. For fear of hitting their troops, the bombardment was cancelled. 2 days later, when we tried to get confirmation from the tankers of the report of the capture of Brest, we learned that George had hastened his report and that the enemy had not capitulated at all, but had fortified himself in Brest and prepared for a siege. The garrisons at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire had also taken refuge behind their fortifications. Lorient and Saint-Nazaire could wait until the Germans were tired of defence or hunger forced them to capitulate. But Brest had to be taken if only we wanted to have free the sea communications which ran past this fortress into the Bay of Quiberon. In the end, 3 divisions were allocated for the siege of Brest. Only on 19 September, that is, 44 days, after Patton reported the capture of Brest, the garrison of the fortress, numbering 20,000 men, capitulated. By then the siege had borne fruit. Destruction by the enemy, as well as artillery fire and bombardment by Allied aircraft, had turned the harbour into piles of ruins. In Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the Germans sat until the end of the war. To blockade these ports, we needed a whole infantry division, but even it would not have been enough if the French resistance forces did not have 17 infantry battalions which helped us to block the Germans. We could have knocked the enemy out of these 2 fortresses, as we did with Brest, but it was more advantageous for us to blockade them, as the garrisons of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire proved less aggressive than the garrison of Brest, and so did not threaten our supply lines. The siege of Brest is sometimes portrayed as an unnecessary and wasteful campaign, waged mainly because we clung blindly to the outdated Operation Overlord plan of taking Brest. Indeed, the need for the ports of Brittany, which served as a prerequisite for the entire plan of Operation Overlord, disappeared as soon as our rapid advance opened to us the ports of the English Channel and Antwerp. With the capture of Antwerp, one of the largest and best ports in the world. We abandoned our grandiose plans to build a base at Quiberon Bay and from Brest. Not a single ton of cargo has passed through these ports. Why, then, did we expend 3 divisions on Brest, losing nearly 10,000 Americans killed and wounded? Why not surround Brest like Lorient and Stecknazer, or do as Montgomery did with the ports on the Channel? The difference lies in the nature of the enemy's resistance. The garrison at Brest was quite unlike German garrisons in other ports. It was manned by soldiers of the famed 2nd Parachute Division. Fortress Brest was commanded by Major General Hermann Ramke, an energetic and fanatical soldier who could not be content with sitting in a concrete sack. To restrain Ramke and prevent him from marauding our supply lines would have required more troops than we could spare for a secondary front like Brest. Consequently, the decision to take Brest was by no means dictated by the outdated plan of Operation Overlord. I began the costly siege of Brest with Eisenhower's approval, not because we needed a port, but because Ramke did not give us, being unable to blockade Brest. We had to take it and be allowed to concentrate our troops on the main line. I cannot agree with those backward-looking strategists who argue that we should have blockaded the Brittany Peninsula and with all other forces moved eastwards through the vacuum created in France by the breakthrough. To hold a 120-kilometre front on the open flank of our main supply line would have required far more troops than I could have left in the rear during the offensive. In early August, as Third Army was moving through the villages of Brittany, Churchill suddenly announced that he disagreed with Eisenhower's plan to land General Devers's army group on the Mediterranean coast of France. After numerous postponements of Operation Anvil during the previous winter and spring, it was finally decided to begin on 15 August. However, as Devers concentrated his troops in the crowded ship port of Naples, preparing to land at Cannes, Churchill decided to thwart Eisenhower's plan and made a proposal to cancel the landing in the south. Between the south of France, he argued, and the Normandy front there is no direct tactical connection. In addition, Churchill believed that the enemy will be able to limit the area of action diversa area of the Riviera. He suggested moving Devers' troops to Brittany, where they can safely land and join the forces operating in Normandy.
However, Eisenhower expected that the ports of Brittany would be destroyed, and therefore their throughput capacity would not be high until the harbour at Quiberon Bay was completed. But even if the impossible happens and we get in Brittany a few usable ports, they still will not help us to solve the main problem of supply, the transfer of goods from these ports to the front. A landing in the south of France would give us the port of Marseilles. From Marseilles, Devers could establish a second supply line to Serre, and thus break the deadlock, for Serre is closer to Marseilles than to the ports of Brittany.
If the southern part of France was left in German hands, as Churchill suggested, Eisenhower would have to stretch communications across France with an open flank of 800 kilometres from Brittany to the Swiss-German border. To protect these lines of communications from enemy attack would have required a barrier along their entire flank. Ultimately, Eisenhower would have had to send a whole corps, if not more, to fight the enemy in southern France. Having failed to dissuade Eisenhower from landing on the Mediterranean coast, Churchill went to the front to try to find out the opinion of commanders in the field and, perhaps, to win themselves among them supporters. On 7 August, he appeared at our command post at Saint-Sauveur-Lendlen, driving up to the palace along a poplar-lined road. In the trailer, which I had read requisitioned for temporary use as an operations room, the Prime Minister said, nodding at a large-scale map of Normandy hanging on the wall. "It's hard to believe that the last time I was here you were there," and pointed with the end of his cigar to our bridgehead at the top of the map, just below the ceiling. On such a large-scale map, our advance after breaking through the German defences at Saint-Lô looked quite spectacular. When I showed on the map how fast our armoured columns were moving towards Brest, Churchill jabbed his short finger at that port city. "The garrison there," he said, "will die like cut flowers." Then nodding at the blue flags on the map behind Avranches, where we held a 32-kilometre passage between the German 7th Army and the sea, Churchill asked, "Are those divisions?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "We have allowed more than a dozen divisions through that passage." "My God, how would you provide them with food?" Churchill asked again and pointed to the only motorway through the narrow corridor. "Hey, there are actually 2 roads, sir," I explained. "The second one is an auxiliary road. Cars move along both roads without any intervals both day and night." Churchill demanded a black leather box, which was held under his arm by his naval adjutant. With a key hanging on a watch chain, he opened the box and took out a box of Havana cigars. Lighting up, the British Prime Minister carefully placed the extinguished match in a corner and began to talk animatedly about the possible transfer of Diva's troops. "Why," he grumbled, "why break in the back door when the front door is already open with your wonderful American army?" Not wishing to enter into a dispute on a matter that fell within the competence of the General Command of the Allied Expeditionary Force and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I listened but did not express my opinion. At last, having fallen silent, the Prime Minister sank heavily into his chair, looked over his spectacles and said in a questioning tone, "But I am certainly not sure that such a belated change of plans would be advisable." Again he remained silent. Fortunately, things remained unchanged, and Operation Envil, renamed Operation Dragoon, was carried out as planned. Operation Cobra captured the enemy at a moment when the balance of his forces was dangerously out of balance. 6 of his 8 armoured divisions were concentrated on the Montgomery front. When we broke through the enemy's defences at St. Lo, he directed his armoured units towards the breakthrough area. But then, when Middleton's advancing troops on the road to Coutances cut off the Germans from the west bank of the Cotin Peninsula, the enemy suddenly found that his left flank is open and threatened. Now that Patton had sent his tanks into the gap between the Seine and Orleans, and Hodges was covering the open flank of the enemy, the German command had a difficult decision to make where exactly it should seek a decisive battle on the Western Front. Either pull back from the exposed left flank, straighten the front line in a north-south direction, and hold it, ensuring an orderly retreat to the scene, or risk an army and strike at Avranches in an attempt to close the gap and reattach the left flank to the sea. It was important not only to make the right decision, but to make it in time. After all, as long as our corridor at Avranches remained open, the 7th German Army had an unprotected left flank and rear. The longer von Kluge postponed the decision, the more dangerous became his position. Retreat to signposed the enemy a serious problem of transport. The railways were destroyed, and only a few German divisions had their vehicles in sufficient numbers to move on the highways. In addition, to avoid Allied airstrikes, they would have to move only at night. Despite these difficulties, however, the enemy would probably still have had time to withdraw his main forces behind the Seine line. Although aviation could harass his columns and delay their movement, it was in no position to stop them. By moving to the right bank of the Seine, the enemy could reinforce his defences with troops from the Pas de Calais area. In this case, he also reduced his lines of communication and occupied positions close to the bases of German aviation, which was able to provide air support for his ground troops. In contrast to the difficulties of a forced withdrawal to the Seine, the other route offered the enemy a tempting opportunity to go on the offensive, restore the balance and straighten out the front line in Normandy. For if the Germans had succeeded in breaking through our corridor at Avranches to the sea and re-established themselves on the coast, they would have created a narrower front and nullified our advantage in mobility. At the same time, they would again force us to fight on terrain crisscrossed by hedgerows, which was their best ally. Moreover, if von Kluge could close the pass at Avranches, through which we had already let many troops through, these troops would soon find themselves without fuel and ammunition. With luck, the enemy could surround them and destroy them. So this option was quite risky, but at the same time very tempting. However, before taking the serious risks associated with the offensive, the enemy had to weigh all the possible disadvantages. The strategic advantages of the offensive at Avranches were undoubted, but it exceeded the tactical capabilities of the Germans. Had the choice been given to the German commanders on the ground, they would undoubtedly have rejected the offensive and preferred a safe withdrawal behind the Seine. They were aware of the vacuum that was behind them and realized that a defeat on the Normandy front could open the Allies all the way to the Rik. They knew far better than Hitler's sycophants in Berlin how much weaker they were than we were in Normandy. But it was characteristic of the Nazi regime that only the Führer himself, not his commanders, could make such a responsible decision. And so Hitler, who was in a distant bet on the Eastern Front, unhesitatingly ordered von Kluge to hold on to the positions he occupied in Normandy and go on the counter-offensive with the task of closing the passage and restore the front at Avranches. It was this decision, more than anything else, that determined the German defeat in the Battle of France. It was not until 1 o'clock in the morning of 6-7 August that the enemy gathered sufficient strength to launch his fatal offensive. He directed a blow at Mortagne, located 32 kilometers east of the shallow bay of Mont Saint-Michel. 5 Panzer and SS divisions formed the shock fist of the offensive grouping. This was the Germans' first major counter-offensive in France. Their second and last counter-offensive was the Battle of the Ardennes. For the offensive, the enemy had withdrawn his tanks from the Montgomery front and had taken infantry from the Pas-de-Calais area. Only now, 2 months after the Allied invasion, the German command realized that it had been deceived and that an entire German army had stood idle in vain in the decisive hour of the Battle of France. Just one night before, Major General Leland Hobbs' 30th Division had replaced the 1st Division thrown in to outflank the German flank. Thinned and exhausted from 2 weeks of fighting, units of the 30th Division took up positions vacated by the withdrawal of the 1st Division. These positions had been chosen by the 1st Division during the offensive and did not have sufficient depth for defence. A few hours later, the enemy broke through the first of Hobbs's lines. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Regiment was crushed and cut off from the main force. For 6 days, this doomed battalion responded with fire to German demands for surrender and continued to defend its position with firm determination. In late August, it radioed for urgent medical supplies. We sent out a link of C-47 aircraft, but the enemy opened heavy anti-aircraft fire and the aircraft dropped more than half of the cargo into the enemy position. Then the 30th Division stuffed artillery shells with vials of morphine and sulfur preparation and released them over the heads of the enemy into the battalion's location. On 12 August, our troops broke through to the battalion, and it was withdrawn from its position surrounded by piles of corpses of German soldiers. For this battle, which was one of the most heroic fights of the entire war, the battalion received the President's commendation. By his reckless advance on Avranches through the positions of the 30th Division at Mortagne, the enemy forced us to make the most important decision of the entire campaign in France. It cost the enemy an army and gave us France. Winston Churchill, 6 months later, called it one of the boldest of the whole war. When the Germans struck, only Hobbs's division was blocking the path of von Kluge's tanks to the sea. By midday, the German offensive had assumed threatening proportions, and Hodges hastily sent reinforcements from the First Army to help Hobbs in order to prevent the enemy from cutting into our lines. 2 infantry divisions approached the 30th Division on its left, and an armoured division moved out on its right flank in readiness to begin an attack on the enemy's exposed flank. By this time, 12 American divisions had already passed through the corridor at Avranches. If the enemy moved through Mortagne, he could cut their communications and lock them deep behind his lines. Of the 12 divisions, 4 were not yet in combat. They were to move rapidly eastwards, reach the line between the Seine and Orleans and cut off the enemy's escape route. We had a choice to make. 1. Either act prudently and bring back these last 4 divisions in order to reinforce Hodges's defences at Mortagne and thus secure our communications in Brittany. And 2. Or risk taking advantage of the enemy's breakthrough in the Mortagne area to throw these 4 divisions on his open flank and attempt to destroy the German 7th Army. Betting on the success of the counter-offensive of von Kluge's tanks, Hitler exposed before us the entire stretched flank of the German forces, exposing it to a blow and encirclement from the south. If we could move a large force in the eastern direction while the enemy advances at Mortain and turn them then to the north, we would thereby implement a wide encompassing manoeuvre and cut off his entire army. I decided to go for it and destroy the German troops in the west. A week later, this decision led to the creation of the Argentan-Falaise Cauldron. There, in one of the fiercest battles on the Western Front, the enemy lost his 7th Army, and with it his last hope of holding on to France. He had to flee from Argentan to the German border, covering a distance of almost 500 kilometers. However, unlike Hitler, we carefully weighed Morton's chances of success. The possibility of encircling the enemy army justified the risk, but we did not want to act rashly. During the first 24 hours of the enemy's advance, I kept 4 divisions south of Mortain ready as a reserve. Meanwhile, to the right of the 30th Division, a wide gap had formed in our front line. In order to cover this gap before the Germans discovered it, I took the 35th Division from Patton and turned it over to Hodges. If the enemy had sent his tank formation south a few thousand meters, he could have broken through to Avranches on the first day. On the morning of 8 August, I checked the situation at Hodges and found that he was holding firm. The Germans had failed to deepen their incursion and were clearly exhausted. I decided that Hodges would hold out especially if supported by air power. The intelligence and operations chiefs agreed with my judgment. We only needed a forecast of good weather in order to strike in the eastern direction and then turn north and cover the open flank of the enemy. We received such a forecast that morning. We were promised cloudless good weather for several days. I handed the weather report to Levin Allen. "Let's get started," I told him, "and throw everything we have to the east." The order was sent to Patton. While Middleton was pursuing the enemy in Brittany, Major General Walton Walker's 20th Corps was to strike towards the passage between the Seine and Orleans. At the same time, Major General Wade Haslip's 15th Corps, which was in the vicinity of Le Mans, was turning north to the junction of roads at Argentan with the task of blocking the enemy's main escape route. On 6 August, after the enemy withdrew his tanks from the front at Caen and moved them to Mortain, Montgomery ordered the British and Canadian armies to move towards the Seine. Eyrat, commander of the Canadian army operating on the left, was to take the road from Caen to Falaise and from there turn northeast to Rouen. Dempsey, who was on the right, moved on the main highway which ran eastwards through Argentan, 40 kilometres south of Falaise. The enemy had not yet launched an offensive on Mortain, and Montgomery's plans were based on the assumption that von Kluge would withdraw from his positions in Normandy to a defensive line along the Seine River. A few days earlier, when Montgomery had outlined his plans at a meeting, Dempsey had cheerfully offered a wager that he would overtake the American troops and arrive at Argentan earlier. I did not dispute Bimbo Dempsey's optimism, for in carrying out the broad bypass manoeuvre, which was to bring us to Argentan, we had a much longer way to go. On the evening of 7 August, the Canadians moved up the road to Falaise. Bomber aviation cleared their way. By noon the next day, however, they encountered stubborn resistance, for the enemy had fortified himself at Falaise, covering his communications, which provided him with a transfer of troops to our corridor in Mortain. Seeing that the situation had changed as a result of the enemy's advance on Mortain, Montgomery revised his plans. He decided to join us and capture von Kluge in pincers. While the American troops came in from the south, he was to move from the north through Falaise, with the task of cutting off the enemy located to the west and destroy his 7th Army. As Ike's representative, Monty was responsible for coordinating the actions of all 4 Allied armies. Haslip's 15th Corps was to outflank the enemy from the south and reach Argentan. This city was in the band of action of the British, 20 kilometres from the boundary line. But since here was a junction of roads of strategic importance, where our pincers were to close, Monty willingly forgave us the violation of the boundaries. "We'll go as far as Argentan and entrench there," I said to Patton. "We must be careful not to run into Monty coming from Falaise."
Closing his half of the pincers from the north, Monty was to advance rapidly along the road from Caen through Falaise and hold the line 20 kilometres south of Falaise. Once he had closed the passage between Falaise and Argentan, the enemy's last avenue of retreat from Mortain would be cut off. But we needed time to approach Argentan from the south and close the pincers, and we hoped that the Germans would continue their fruitless offensive long enough to give us an opportunity to outflank them. On the second day of the enemy offensive at Mortain, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau visited our army group during another tour of the theatre of operations. Hobbs' 30th Division held its ground with such courage and tenacity that we called it Morton's Rock. Meanwhile, British Typhoon aircraft armed with rockets joined the American Air Force and attacked von Kluge's tanks until the enemy positions were covered with black plumes of smoke from burning tanks.
In acquainting Morgenthau with the situation that morning, I showed on the map the place where the German front line south of Mortain turned back, and explained how we press on the enemy from his open flank. "Such an opportunity falls to the lot of a commander not more than once in 100 years, I said. "We're about to destroy an entire enemy army." Morgenthau was sceptical of my words, but I pointed to the German wedge at Mortain and outlined the reasons that entitled me to make such a statement. "If the enemy continues his offensive in the Mortain area for another 48 hours, he said, "he will give us time to close the encirclement ring at Argentan and completely destroy it. And when he loses his 7th Army in this cauldron, he will have no strength left to fight us. We'll move from here to the German border unimpeded." I'm not sure Morgenthau believed me. We had to go another 560 kilometres east to the border. On 11 August, exactly 48 hours after Morgenthau's arrival, Von Kluge finally admitted that he could no longer carry out Hitler's order for an offensive in the Morton area. He recommended abandoning the reckless offensive and withdrawing to the Seine. The next day Hitler agreed to the withdrawal, but on the condition that von Kluge would push the enemy away from his left flank and rear. With the same success, Hitler could have ordered his commander to reverse the course of the Seine. Our 15th Corps, consisting of 2 infantry and 2 armoured divisions, had already reached the junction of roads in Argentan and was about to close the passage. Meanwhile, Monty acted in the north with less and less success. In 5 days of offensive, he had advanced the Canadian half of the pincers to Falaise, only halfway. On the evening of 12 August, Hayslip reached Argentan, but Monty was stuck in the north, and a gap of 30 kilometres remained between the British and American forces. Patton telephoned me that evening from his command post near Laval. "Our units are at Argentan," he reported. "Let me move on to Falaise and we will throw the British into the sea, giving them a second Dunkirk." "By no means," I replied, "for I feared a collision with Montgomery's troops. You must not move beyond Argentan. Stop at the line you have reached and entrench yourself. Seibert says the Germans are beginning to withdraw. Better get ready to meet the enemy." Patton had long doubted that Monty could close the passage at Argentan, so he ordered the 15th Corps to move through Argentan to Falaise. By the time George called me, Hayslip's tanks had already moved out of Argentan. However, my orders were so emphatic that George returned Hayslip without a word. While we were impatiently waiting for Monty in Argentan, the enemy strengthened the defences of the corridor. Vanguards of tank troops and S units were already withdrawing through the corridor, heading for the Seine. But instead of redoubling his efforts and cutting off the Germans' escape route, Monty increased the pressure on the enemy remaining in the western part of the cauldron. He did not close the gap at Falaise, but continued to push the enemy back to the Seine. If the tactics of Monty puzzled me, Eisenhower it just frightened. And at the 3rd Army Command Post, where the defeated officers watched helplessly as the spoils slipped away from them, Patton was cursing Montgomery for a grave mistake. George was doubly annoyed because he himself had not been allowed to close the passage. But Monty never objected, and I never suggested that the passage between Argentan and Falaise be closed by American troops alone. I was quite content with our original task and did not wish to undertake another. Although Patton could close this narrow neck of the river, I doubted whether he could hold it. 19 German divisions were panicking to escape the trap, and George with 4 divisions already blocked the 3 main escape routes through Alençon, Sea and Argentan. If he advanced his troops as far as Falaise, he would have to cover an additional 65 kilometres. A rapidly retreating enemy could not only break through but also crush Patton. I, of course, preferred to hold firmly on the line at Argentan rather than march on Falaise at the risk of breaking my neck. Besides, I did not want to risk a collision between the 2 armies, which might have happened if Patton had moved on Falaise. Any counter-movement becomes a dangerous and uncontrollable manoeuvre unless each side is stopped at a certain point according to a pre-arranged plan. The haphazard thrusting of the Americans into the battle lines of Montgomery's advancing troops could easily have led to dangerous confusion, for the British could have mistaken us for Germans. However, detaining Patton in Argentan, I did not inform Montgomery about it. That decision was mine alone. It never went beyond my command post. Although the enemy's prearranged positions on the road to Falaise were undoubtedly stronger than those through which we had broken through on our way to Argentan, still I was dissatisfied with Montgomery, who had not closed the passage in time. After all, having been repulsed on the road to Falaise, he could have moved further east and slammed the trap door at Chambord, which he had to do a week later. While Berlin radio was poking fun at us, calling our actions a desperate attempt to destroy the German army before we capitulated to the shell planes, Patton was running from corner to corner in his command post in a rage, clutching intelligence reports of enemy divisions fleeing through the pass. "Damn it, they're all gone now," he shouted. "Instead of waiting here for Monty, we should have moved on. There is no enemy between me and the Seine." Although I shared George's indignation at having to stand idle the Argentine bulge, I did not agree with him about the number of Germans who had slipped the trap. Allied aircraft were bombing enemy columns and artillery was firing heavily on the roads, and von Kluge could withdraw in 2 days and 2 nights, only a small fraction of the 19 divisions that were grinding inside the slowly tightening noose. Having decided a few days before that I could not close the Falaise passage without jeopardizing my Argentan bulge, I now had to choose between three possible courses of action. 1. We could not move from our position until all the Germans had left the cauldron. 2. We could reduce the number of our troops on the Bulge, advance 16 kilometres in a northeasterly direction to Chambois, and cut another enemy escape route. 3. Finally, we could leave part of our forces at Argentan and wait to link up with the approaching Montgomery troops, and throw the rest of the forces in an easterly direction in order to seize a bridgehead on the opposite bank of the Seine. The first option meant essentially doing nothing and could not produce concrete results. The second promised a small reward, although we could not close the trap with the capture of Chambord, but would narrow the throat and perhaps slow down the escape of the enemy from the cauldron. The third option, a rapid rush to the Seine, opened the greatest tactical opportunities. After all, if Patton seized a bridgehead on the east bank of the Seine, he would deprive the enemy of the last reliable chance to gain a foothold on this line. But here we were taking the risk ourselves. By advancing towards the Seine instead of towards Chambord, we gave the enemy an opportunity to escape from the Falaise cauldron. Usually the first objective of a belligerent is to destroy the enemy army. Was the bridgehead on the Seine important enough to justify violating this law of war? George helped me resolve my doubts. On 14 August, he asked my permission by telephone to withdraw 2 of Hayslip's 4 divisions from the Argentine Bulge and throw them towards the Seine. I immediately rejected the first 2 options and agreed with Patton on the third. If Montgomery, I thought, wanted us to help him, let him ask us to do so. But since such a request was unlikely, we would move east. Moving to the Seine, Patton was to lead the Third Army in 3 directions. 1 corps in the south, to Orleans, another in the centre, to Chartres, the third, in the north, UA to Druex, 65 kilometres west of Paris. From Dreux-Hayslip was to turn northeast to Mantoux, and there, 56 kilometres north of Paris. Early Hayslip moved to the place of forcing the Seine, as Montgomery suggested, that we move our southern covering grouping from Argentan to the northeast to Chambois. Monty has already sent there the Polish armoured division, aiming to close the ring of encirclement of the enemy. I agree with you, sir, I said to Monty. We should move northeast. In fact, I'd already sent 2 divisions northeast to the Seine, and was 120 kilometres east of Montgomery's Chambois as objective. While Monty was catching his breath on the other end of the wire, I tried to fight the doubts that had gripped me. Was I doing the right thing? After all, if we did not move to the Saône, we could close the Falaise passage to Chambois and take more prisoners. At the time of my conversation with Patton, I was unaware of Monty's decision to move southeast to Chambois. For the first and only time during the war, I went to bed feeling an agonizing sense of uncertainty, and now I still don't know whether we should have postponed our advance towards the Seine and moved instead towards Chambois. Although a bridgehead on the opposite bank of the Seine hastened our further advance, the capture of Chambois would have allowed us to take more prisoners. August 19, that is 12 days after the enemy attacked us at Mortagne, and 6 days after Patton reached Argentan, Montgomery closed the ring of encirclement in Chambois, 25 kilometres southeast of Falaise. More than 70,000 demoralised German soldiers were killed or captured in this cauldron. Nevertheless, during the 5 days that Patton waited for Monty at Argentan, thousands of Germans broke free from encirclement. But even this circumstance could not diminish the significance of our victory at Mortagne, which was achieved as a result of Hitler's blunt stubbornness. The bulk of the 19 German divisions were ground up in a cauldron. Only mobile units escaped. They slipped out in separate small groups. The enemy west of the Seine was destroyed, and after that the liberation of France was a matter of days. Between the Orne and the Seine, German troops were still blocking the 21st Army Group Monty. But after the American troops reached the Seine, von Kluge had nothing to do but withdraw to save at least the remnants of his army. The whole world watched in amazement at the speed with which Patton was advancing to the Seine. But the brunt of the fighting with the Germans in the Falaise cauldron was borne on their shoulders by Hodges's First Army, for the enemy, despite the hopelessness of his situation, did not at all easily fall into despair. Even division commanders marvelled at the ferocity of the German resistance in the Falaise cauldron. One division commander, having visited an advance battalion that was fighting an encircled enemy, tried to assure the weary officers of the battalion headquarters that only second-rate Germans were against them. A tired-looking lieutenant, the battalion's intelligence chief, looked up with inflamed eyes and said dryly to his commander, "General, I think you should have assessed the Boches differently. They apparently don't know themselves that they are as bad as you think. During the battle in the Argentan Falaise area, Patton's success was measured in kilometres travelled and Hodges' success was measured in the number of enemy killed. Thus, neither of them could claim superiority, as their tasks were quite different. Nevertheless, if the number of killed is an indicator of the ferocity and intensity of the battle, then the First Army can claim to have borne the brunt of the offensive. In 19 days, the Third Army went from Arfranches to the Seine, and the First Army, which eliminated the Argentan cauldron, lost 19,000 men. Its losses were almost twice the losses of the Third Army, operating on the open flank of the enemy. 19 August, on a foggy morning, when we closed the ring of encirclement in the area of Chambord, Montgomery called a meeting to coordinate his advance to the Seine with ours. We met halfway between our command posts and sat down with clipboards in hand under a fresh haystack by the roadside. Although we had already reached the Mantes-Orleans line in accordance with the plan of Operation Overlord, the British had not yet approached the Seine. Intending to encircle the German units that broke out of the Falaise cauldron, and at the same time to pave the way for the British advance, I suggested Dempsey to send 2 British divisions to bypass Avranches on the way Patton's army to the Seine and their turn north to close the outer ring of encirclement west of the Seine. "We'll give you lorries to make that run," I promised, assuming he would need help making such a long crossing. Bimbo replied, picking at his teeth with a straw. "Oh no, Brad, thank you. We can't do it. I can't spare 2 divisions for such a big push." In order not to miss the opportunity to close the second ring of encirclement of the enemy west of the Seine, I proposed to turn the American troops in a northerly direction to the English sector and cut off the enemy on the left bank. "If you can't do that, Bimbo," I said, "you won't mind if we try, but it would mean cutting into the disposition of our troops." "Why not?" he replied. "We'd be glad if you did. It is only a pity that we ourselves cannot commit troops to the task." Monty nodded his head in agreement. "We foresaw that the movement of American troops through the fighting order of the British will cause considerable confusion. After all, 80,000 soldiers who went north will have to go back and cross the road to the British moving to the Seine. Nevertheless, we were so keen to intercept the enemy fleeing eastwards that we sent 4 divisions northwards along the left bank of the Seine. By 25 August, they had marched over 50 kilometres across the English front line and approached the outskirts of the Gothic city of Rouen. This unexpected manoeuvre caused panic in the enemy, retreating in front of Montgomery's troops. We not only closed the Seine between Mantes and Rouen, we forced the Germans to force it in a narrow section near the mouth. When German columns piled up at the ferry crossing, Allied aircraft appeared and began shelling and bombing them. Then for 2 days our artillery shelled these troops, and the ferry area was visible from afar by the columns of smoke that rose to the summer sky. Dempsey now advanced, almost without resistance, to that section west of the Seine which we had cleared for him. When he reached the sign near Mantes, we gave him a ready bridgehead, then to draw the American troops back across the British front line, where the roads were clogged with lorries, Hodges, and Dempsey agreed to regulate traffic at all junctions. British and American columns were alternately given 2 hours, each to pass these intersections until the American troops were fully withdrawn to their sector. A few days later, when English newspaper correspondents questioned Dempsey about his progress toward the Seine, he stated that he could have gone faster if it had not been for the American lorries that were interfering with the movement of his troops. Although we were perhaps oversensitive to all censure, yet my ego was hurt when I learned that the one who had most to gain from our manoeuvre regarded it as a hindrance. I reminded Monty that it had been far more profitable for Dempsey to use half the day's roads cleared by the Americans from the enemy than to advance for a whole day on roads still occupied by the Germans. Had we not sent our troops northward to help Dempsey, we might have advanced far east of Paris and captured more territory. But again, I would like to say that we were willing to give up the conquest of territory in order to exterminate as many Germans as possible. Monty later apologized for Dempsey's speech to reporters. "Bimbo," he explained, told me he had been misunderstood.